At 6:42 p.m. on Veterans Day, my son stood at the microphone inside American Legion Post 184 and told 200 people I had stolen my dead husband's medals. He did not look angry. He looked sorrowful and prepared, the way a man looks when he has practiced cruelty until it sounds like concern. The mayor was there, the post commander was there. A county judge sat beneath the row of service flags with his hands folded over the printed program. My place card had been moved from the family table to a small round table near the kitchen doors, beside the coffee urn and a stack of extra napkins. My son held up my Greenfield jacket and said, "My mother has been confused since Dad passed. She has started wearing honors that were never hers. Tonight, before this scholarship goes any further, our family needs to protect the truth." Forks stopped moving. A chair creaked. Somewhere near the back, a woman whispered my name and then went quiet. My granddaughter sat at the front table in her navy dress, watching her father decide which version of me she was allowed to inherit. The post commander frowned, but he did not interrupt. That silence gave my son more power than the microphone did. What David did not know was that the truth was already in the room. In my purse was a certified copy of my DD Form 214, attached to a county clerk's page with a raised seal. Under my chair was a battered blue flight logbook with a coffee stain across the year 2004. And 2 tables behind, my son sat the retired master sergeant whose life he had just called a lie. David had the microphone, I had the record. He had the printed program. I had the original orders. He held up my jacket as if it proved confusion. He had not noticed the silver eagle on the collar. My husband had worn stripes. I had worn rank. I stayed seated not because I had no answer, but because accusation has to finish speaking before evidence can answer. Before dessert was served, the same post commander who let my son erase me would have to correct my rank into that microphone. Before the night ended, the room that avoided my eyes would be looking at him. And before my granddaughter left that hall, she would know that silence is not the same thing as shame. To understand why my own son believed he could erase me in a room full of veterans, you have to understand how slowly a woman can be edited out of her own story. My name is Eleanor Whitaker. Most people in Henderson County knew me as Ellie. For 31 years, the Air Force knew me as Whitaker, E.M., Nurse Corps, and for the last 7 of those years, Colonel Whitaker. The Air Force offered me a scholarship and a way to serve. I took both. I learned how to start an IV in turbulence, how to read a monitor by the glow of a red cabin light, how to keep my fear folded small enough to fit inside my left glove. I learned that a C-130 full of wounded men has its own sound. Not loud, exactly. A kind of breathing, a kind of prayer. I was not infantry. I never pretended to be. I carried no rifle into a village. I kicked no doors. I was a flight nurse, then a chief nurse, then commander of an aeromedical evacuation squadron. My job was to keep people alive between the place where they were broken and the place where surgeons could put them back together. We had one child, David. Late enough in my career that everyone warned me it would be hard. They were right. Motherhood and military service do not shake hands gently. They wrestle. There were birthday cakes eaten over video calls. There were Christmas mornings when Tom held the camera while David opened packages. I had wrapped 3 weeks early. There were school concerts I missed because somebody else's son was bleeding over Iraq. And there were nights I came home with my duffel bag, still smelling of aircraft fuel and disinfectant, only to find my boy taller, quieter, and less certain where I fit. I told myself children grow into understanding. That was my first mistake. Tom did what good fathers do. He filled the gaps. He packed lunches. He coached Little League. He sat through parent-teacher conferences and church pageants and dentist appointments. When David asked why Mom had to leave again, Tom told him the truth as gently as he could. "Your mother brings wounded people home," he said. "And then she comes home to us. But a child measures love by presence before he learns to measure it by purpose." David loved me. I know he did. But he adored his father with the uncomplicated loyalty children give the parent who is there to zip the jacket, cut the pancakes, and chase away monsters at midnight. I do not blame him for that. What I blame myself for is letting that childhood version of the story become the only version he ever carried. When David was 17, he found my metal box in the top of the linen closet. He pulled out the ribbons, the citations, the photographs, and the old name tapes, then asked me what they meant. I had just returned from a difficult rotation through Ramstein, moving wounded service members from downrange hospitals to Germany and then onward to the States. My body was home. My mind was still somewhere over the Atlantic, counting respirations in the dark. I told him, "They're just old work things." He said, Dad told me you flew into dangerous places. I shrugged. Your dad makes everything sound bigger than it was. Tom heard me from the doorway. Later that night, after David went to bed, he stood beside the kitchen sink and said, Ellie, you keep making yourself small in front of that boy. I don't want him thinking his mother is trying to be some kind of hero. You're not trying to be one. That doesn't mean you weren't one to somebody. I laughed it off because I was tired, and because humility can become a hiding place if you use it too long. Years passed. David grew up, went into commercial insurance, married a woman named Lauren, and bought a house 8 minutes from ours. Tom and I became grandparents to a girl named Grace, who had his dimples and my stubborn chin. By then, I had retired from the Air Force, my knees complained on cold mornings, and I had learned to sleep through the night without listening for alarms that were no longer there. For a while, our family almost looked simple. Sunday dinners, church bazaars, Grace leaving crayons in our sofa cushions, Tom teaching her how to plant tomatoes, me teaching her how to check a pulse on her own wrist. When she was 6, she asked, Grandma, were you a soldier? David answered before I could. Grandpa was a soldier. Grandma was a nurse. He said it warmly, not cruelly, and I let it pass. I told myself he meant no harm. I told myself precision did not matter around a Sunday table. But little girls listen to every word adults leave lying around. Tom was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer the week after Grace turned 9. The doctor said the word gently. There's no gentle way to say a word that sharp. Tom took the news better than the rest of us. He made a list of things to fix before he got too weak. The porch rail, the will, the truck title, the basement freezer that hummed like a lawnmower. He moved through those early weeks with the same practical courage he had brought to everything else. One afternoon, I found him sitting in the garage with my old field jacket across his lap. It was green and faded, with my name tape over the right pocket and the ghost of a squadron patch still visible on the shoulder. The silver eagles were pinned to the collar because Tom had insisted I keep them there. You ought to put this in a shadow box, he said. It's just a jacket. He looked up at me, thinner than he had been a month before. There you go again. I sat beside him on an upside-down bucket. He ran his thumb over the name tape. David thinks I was the hero of this family, he said. You were. No, he shook his head. I was the one who got to stay home more. That mattered. It did, but it wasn't the whole truth. I remember the smell of oil and sawdust in that garage. I remember a mourning dove calling from the gutter. I remember wanting to change the subject because the truth was too tender to touch. Tom lifted the jacket slightly. When I'm gone, don't let them hang my name over your life. I promised him I wouldn't. I meant it when I said it. Promises are easier before grief makes cowards of us. Tom died on a Wednesday morning in March, just before sunrise. His hand was in mine. David stood at the foot of the bed, crying so hard he looked 12 years old again. Lauren made phone calls from the hallway, in a careful voice. Grace sat downstairs with a neighbor, coloring a picture of a yellow house with 3 windows and too many flowers. After the burial, the honor guard presented me with the folded flag from Tom's army service. I held it against my chest while David wept into my shoulder. I thought grief might bring us closer. For a few months, it did. Then Lauren started using the word stability, so I let them plan more than I should have. I gave them access to old photographs. I showed them Tom's discharge papers. I opened the cedar chest where we kept uniforms, albums, flags, and packets of letters tied with ribbon. Lauren moved through those items carefully, respectfully, making little notes in a leather notebook. When she lifted my field jacket, she paused. This was Tom's? No, I said. Mine. She looked at the name tape. Whitaker. We shared a last name. She laughed lightly. Of course. I just mean it looks so military. It is military. David glanced over from the doorway. Mom was Air Force. Lauren smiled. Right. Medical. I could have explained it then. I could have pointed to the eagles, the squadron patch, the flight logbook beneath the photographs. I could have said, that jacket went with me through more than you understand. Instead, I closed the cedar chest. It's old, I said. Another small cut. Another silence. The first donor brochure arrived in May. Lauren had designed it with a sepia photograph of Tom in uniform on the front. The title read, The Thomas Whitaker Legacy Scholarship. My name appeared on the back page as Mrs. Thomas Whitaker, surviving spouse. I stared at that line for a long time. Surviving spouse is not inaccurate, but accuracy can still be used to narrow a life until only one room remains. I called David. Honey, the scholarship is supposed to be in both our names. He sighed. Mom, Dad just died. People are responding to his story. It was our money, our plan. I know, but Dad's service is what inspires people. The sentence hung between us. What do you think my service did? I asked. He went quiet. Then he said, I didn't mean it that way. I wanted to believe him, so I did. By summer, the small cuts had become a pattern. Lauren corrected people when they called me Colonel. She doesn't use that anymore, she would say, smiling. David started driving me to appointments I had not asked him to attend. At the bank, he answered questions before I could. At the attorney's office, he placed a hand on my shoulder and said, Mom gets overwhelmed by forms. I did get overwhelmed sometimes. Not by forms, by the discovery that my grown son could speak over me with the confidence of a man who thought love gave him ownership. One July afternoon, Grace and I were baking peach cobbler when she asked, Grandma, did you ever win medals? I smiled. You don't win them, sweetheart. They're awarded. Daddy said Grandpa got the real ones. The spoon stopped in my hand. What else did Daddy say? She looked worried, as if she had betrayed someone by repeating it. He said sometimes people remember things wrong when they get old. I set the spoon down carefully. I'm old enough to need reading glasses, I said. I am not old enough to forget my own life. She nodded, but I could see the confusion in her eyes. Children do not know what to do when adults give them competing truths. They usually believe the louder one. By August, Lauren had formed a foundation committee. I found out after the first meeting, not before. She said it was just a planning group and that she did not want to burden me. Burden became the next word. Stability, burden, confusion. 3 polite words can build a cage if people repeat them at the right meetings. The foundation committee included 2 local business owners, a retired pastor, a banker who had played golf with Tom, and American Legion Post Commander Walter Harris. Walt had known Tom for years. He had always treated me kindly enough, though mostly as Tom's widow. When I entered a room, he asked how I was holding up. When David entered, he asked about scholarship plans. That told me where the story had settled. The first time I saw the Veterans Day dinner program, my hands went cold. Lauren left a proof copy on my kitchen counter, probably by accident. The front page showed Tom's portrait, the American flag, and the words honoring the sacrifice of Sergeant First Class Thomas Whitaker. Inside, under family remarks, it listed David Whitaker, son, under closing prayer, Pastor Ben Aldridge. Under scholarship presentation, Lauren Whitaker, Foundation Director. My name was not there. Not as founder. Not as donor. Not as Tom's wife. Not even as a guest. I called David and asked him to come over. He arrived in his work clothes, tie loosened, phone in his hand. Lauren waited in the car. I could see her through the window, engine running. I held up the program. Was I removed by accident? He rubbed his forehead. Mom, please don't start. That's not an answer. We're trying to make the evening smooth. Smooth for whom? His jaw tightened. You've been emotional. My husband died. I know. No, David, I don't think you do. He looked toward the front window, then back at me. Lauren thinks it would be better if you just attended and let us handle the speaking. Lauren thinks she's done a lot for this foundation. So have I. I funded it. He flinched because that was true. Tom's life insurance and part of my retirement savings had funded the scholarship trust. David and Lauren had organized the public face of it, but the money came from our marriage. From decades of saving, deployments, extra shifts, missed vacations, and Tom's stubborn habit of fixing old appliances instead of replacing them. David lowered his voice. You're making this about yourself. I stared at him. No, I said. I am asking not to be erased from something your father and I built together. He looked tired suddenly, and younger. You left a lot, Mom. There it was. The old wound, finally speaking in its own voice. I set the program down. Yes, I said. I did, and I came back every time. Dad was the one who stayed. I know. You don't get to come in now and act like you carried the same weight. The words struck deep because some part of me had feared them for 30 years. I had carried wounded strangers across oceans. Tom had carried our son through childhood. Both weights were real, but David had decided only one counted. He reached for the program. We'll save you a seat. At the family table? He did not answer. After he left, I sat alone in the kitchen until the room grew dark. I could hear Tom's voice as clearly as if he were standing by the sink. Don't let them hang my name over your life. The next morning, I drove to see Adele Monroe. I brought the program proof, the scholarship, trust documents, and my service binder. Adele poured black coffee into 2 mugs and read everything without interrupting. When she finished, she looked over her glasses. How long have you allowed this? The question irritated me because it was fair. I was grieving. Yes, I didn't want to fight my son. Also, yes, I thought the truth would be obvious. Adele leaned back. Truth is not always obvious to people who benefit from ignoring it. I looked down at my hands. He thinks I'm trying to compete with Tom. Are you? No? Then stop defending against an accusation you have not made. Correct the record. I don't want to humiliate him. Adele's expression softened, but her voice did not. Ellie, you cannot protect a grown man from the consequences of using your dignity as kindling. I blinked back tears. She tapped the service binder. Do not fight adjectives. Gather nouns, dates, signatures, records. That sentence steadied me. For the next 3 weeks, I did what 31 years in uniform had trained me to do. I built a file, not a scrapbook, a file. I requested a certified copy of my DD Form 214 through the County Veteran Service Office. The clerk, a young man with a Marine Corps tattoo on his forearm, looked at my original documents, then at me, then stood a little straighter. Colonel, I can have this certified by Friday. It had been months since anyone in town had called me by rank without being prompted. I nearly thanked him too warmly. I pulled my award citations from the binder and made copies. Air Medal with 2 oak leaf clusters. Meritorious Service Medal. Air Force Commendation Medal. Southwest Asia Service Medal. Iraq Campaign Medal. Humanitarian Service Medal. None of them made me better than anyone else. They simply made the accusation false. I found the flight logbook in the cedar chest beneath Tom's winter scarf. Blue cover, corners bent, coffee stain across 2 pages from a night at Ramstein when a young captain had bumped my elbow during a casualty handoff. Inside were dates, aircraft tail numbers, mission notes, initials, and the small private shorthand I used to remember the lives behind the litters. The 18th of March, 2004. Balad to Landstuhl. 6 urgent surgical, 1 ventilated, 1 traumatic amputation. Reeves, S. kept pressure through descent. Sang You Are My Sunshine off key. Survived. I had not thought of Samuel Reeves in years. His name sat on the page like a door I was afraid to open. Adele found him before I decided whether to try. He lives in Knoxville, she said over the phone. Retired Master Sergeant Samuel Reeves. Lost part of his left leg. Volunteers with a Veterans Adaptive Sports Group. He remembers you. My throat tightened. What did you tell him? Only that a public correction may become necessary. And? He said he has been waiting 22 years to buy you a cup of coffee. I sat down on the edge of my bed. The next layer arrived by accident. Or by providence, depending on how a person chooses to view timing. Adele called me on a Wednesday evening and asked if I still had access to Tom's email account. I did. He had written passwords in a little black notebook because he distrusted clouds, automatic updates, and anything that asked him to create a security question. What are we looking for? I asked. Oral history. 6 months before his diagnosis, Tom had participated in the County Veterans Center's Living Memory Project. I remembered the afternoon. He had worn his army cap and complained that nobody needed to hear an old mechanic talk about tow bars and engine grease. Adele had interviewed him anyway for the archive. I had baked banana bread for the volunteers and gone home before they started recording. He signed a release, Adele said. The Veterans Center has a copy, but Tom also asked for the digital file afterward. Check his email. I searched his account and found a message from the Veterans Center with the subject line, Whitaker Interview Final Audio. My hands shook before I opened it. Tom's voice filled my quiet kitchen. Not sick, not weak, full, warm, teasing Adele about her microphone placement, laughing when she asked him to state his full name. I sat at the table and listened to the dead come back in the only way they can. For the first 20 minutes, he talked about growing up, joining the army, learning discipline, becoming a father. He spoke about David with such love that I had to pause the recording and breathe through it. Then Adele's recorded voice asked, Tom, what would you want future generations to understand about service? He was quiet for a few seconds. I'd want them to stop thinking there's only one kind, he said. I turned wrenches. I recovered vehicles. I did my job. But my Ellie flew with a broken voice. She brought them home breathing. I covered my mouth. He continued. People see a nurse and think soft. They never saw her after 3 days without sleep. Standing in a cargo plane over the Atlantic with blood on her sleeves and that calm voice telling everyone what needed doing. She outranked me too, which I enjoyed more than she did. Adele laughed on the recording. Tom said, if my son ever hears this, I want him to know something. Your mother leaving was not abandonment. It was service. I know it hurt you. It hurt me too sometimes. But do not mistake pain for proof that she loved you less. I stopped the recording. The kitchen became very still. I could hear the refrigerator humming. I could hear rain tapping against the back window. I could hear my own breath trying not to become a sob. For 18 months, I had wished Tom were here to explain me to our son. It turned out he had tried. Adele did not let me use the recording immediately. Not yet, she said. That is not a sword you swing because you are hurt. That is a witness you preserve until the record requires it. She was right. I hated that she was right. 2 days later, the certified DD Form 214 arrived. I placed it in a white envelope with the award citations, flight log entries, Tom's interview transcript, the photograph Samuel had given me, and a copy of the scholarship trust documents, naming me co-founder and permanent trustee. Then I waited. Waiting is harder after you have the truth in your hands. On October 28, Lauren came to my house with a folder and a sympathetic smile. I wanted to talk before the banquet, she said. I let her in, because manners are hard habits to break. She placed the folder on my dining room table. Inside was a draft power of attorney. Absolutely not, I said. She lifted both hands gently. Ellie, please, don't react. This is just practical. I commanded nurses in an evacuation squadron. I can manage my checking account. Her smile tightened. No one is questioning your past. You have been questioning it for months. We are concerned about your present. My present understands this document perfectly. She folded her hands, pale nails resting against each other. David is worried. David can come say that to me himself. He's afraid you'll take it as an attack. It is an attack. No, it's protection. There's that word again. She looked genuinely annoyed for the first time. You know, Ellie, humility is admirable until it becomes dishonesty. I stared at her. What does that mean? It means maybe this whole situation would be easier if you admitted that Tom's service is what people want to honor. The room changed temperature. Tom wanted the scholarship in both names. Tom was sick. He was clear. He was devoted to you, she said. Sometimes devotion makes men generous with credit. There it was, sharper than anything David had said. Not confusion, not stability, not burden. The real belief beneath all the careful language. My service was borrowed credit. My dignity was a gift from a generous husband. I slid the folder back toward her. Take this with you. She did not move. If you embarrass David at that dinner, people will remember. Yes, I said. They will. Her eyes narrowed. You don't want to make us prove you've been unstable. For a moment, the house seemed to hold its breath. I had faced officers with tempers, surgeons with egos, generals with impossible timelines, and frightened young medics trying not to fall apart. I had learned that the most dangerous people are not always the ones shouting. Sometimes they are the ones who smile while laying a trap. I stood. Lauren, I think this visit is over. She gathered the folder, but not before I noticed the top sheet beneath the power of attorney. It was not meant for me to see. Petition for emergency guardianship, my name, my address, my son's signature line. After she left, I sat at the dining room table and wrote down everything. Time of arrival, exact document title, exact phrase. You don't want to make us prove you've been unstable. Then I called Adele. Her voice hardened when I told her. They moved from narrative to procedure, she said. What do I do? Now we make sure their procedure meets facts before it meets a judge. The next week, Adele requested the foundation bylaws, committee minutes, donation records, and proposed board resolutions. She had the legal right because she was listed as one of the original advisory trustees, a detail Lauren had missed because she had read the documents for opportunity, not responsibility. The records came reluctantly. They showed that Lauren had scheduled a foundation board vote for immediately after the Veterans Day dinner. The resolution would rename the scholarship, remove me from active decision-making, and authorize David and Lauren to explore a permanent Veterans Leadership Center on the property Tom and I owned near Old Hickory Lake. My property. The small cabin Tom had built with his brother in 1999. The place where Grace learned to skip rocks. The place where Tom's ashes had been scattered beneath the sycamore tree because he said cemeteries made him feel crowded. That was the protected thing beneath all the speeches. Not only my reputation, not only my service, my home, my signature, my husband's memory, my granddaughter's inheritance of the truth. Adele studied the documents at my kitchen table. They need you unstable, she said. Because I won't sell, because you won't surrender control. I looked at Tom's photograph on the shelf. They're using him. Yes. I expected her to soften that answer. She did not. The Veterans Day dinner was 12 days away. During those 12 days, I did not confront David. That took more discipline than any inspection I had ever passed. He called twice. Lauren texted 3 times with reminders about what time I should arrive and what would be appropriate to wear. Appropriate meant plain, quiet, widow-shaped. I chose my dark blue dress, low heels, and a small silver Air Force pin Tom had given me when I retired. Not my uniform, not my medals. I was not going to let them pretend I had staged a costume drama. The field jacket, however, was no longer in my house. Lauren had borrowed it for the memorial display weeks earlier, along with Tom's cap, his folded flag, and several photographs. I had asked for it back. She said it was already locked in the display case at the American Legion Hall. That bothered me more than I admitted. Not because the jacket was valuable, because it was mine, because the collar still held my silver eagles, because I knew enough by then to understand that objects become dangerous in the hands of people who need them to mean the wrong thing. The American Legion Hall smelled of floor wax, coffee, and baked ham. American flags lined the walls. A long table near the entrance displayed photographs, service caps, folded programs, and the scholarship donation box Lauren had ordered with gold lettering. At the center of the display was my field jacket. My name tape was visible. Whitaker. The silver eagles still sat on the collar, but Lauren had placed Tom's photograph beside it in such a way that anyone passing by would assume the jacket had been his. Beneath the display, a printed card read, Sergeant First Class Thomas Whitaker's field jacket, worn in service to his country. I stood there long enough for the words to blur. Adele stepped beside me. Do you want to correct it now? I watched 2 men in veterans' caps lean over the display. One pointed at the eagles and frowned slightly. The other shrugged and moved on. Not yet, I said. Adele nodded once. A young volunteer led me to a small table near the kitchen doors. My place card read, Mrs. Thomas Whitaker. Not Colonel, not Eleanor, not Founder. Mrs. Thomas Whitaker. I set my purse on the floor and the envelope on my lap. Samuel sat 2 tables behind the podium, as planned. Adele sat beside me, though her place card belonged somewhere else. She turned it face down without looking at it. David spoke after dinner plates were cleared. He walked to the podium carrying a folded program and wearing the grave expression of a man about to ask for sympathy. He began well. That was the painful part. He spoke about Tom's patience, his work ethic, his faith, the way he taught young soldiers to check their equipment twice and complain only after the job was done. People laughed at the right moments. I laughed once too, before I remembered where the speech was going. Then David turned toward the display. My father believed honor had to be protected, he said. Lauren lowered her eyes at the front table. Grace watched her father carefully. David continued, That is why tonight is not only a celebration, it is also a correction. The room shifted. Adele stopped moving. My son lifted my field jacket from the display. He held it up carefully, almost reverently, with my name tape facing the room. My mother has had a difficult year, he said. Anyone who has lost a spouse understands grief can blur memory. Lately, she has claimed parts of my father's service as her own. She has worn his medals. She has told people stories that belong to him. I felt the room turn toward me without fully looking. He had chosen his words well. Claimed, blur, difficult, grief. Every word soft enough to sound compassionate, sharp enough to draw blood. Walt Harris stood near the wall, his mouth tight. He still did not interrupt. David went on, Our family believes the kindest thing is to protect her dignity while correcting the record. Tonight's scholarship will honor real sacrifice, documented service, and the man who held this family together. A woman at the next table stared at her plate. A man coughed once. Grace's eyes filled with confusion. Then David said the sentence that finally ended whatever part of me still wanted to spare him. Mom was a nurse. Dad was the veteran. The silence after that was not empty. It was full of people deciding whether cowardice felt safer than correction. I stood. Not fast. My knees would not allow drama, even if I had wanted it. Adele rose with me. Samuel did not move yet. David looked relieved at first, as if my standing proved his claim. Mom, he said gently into the microphone, please sit down. We're not doing this tonight. I walked toward the podium. Every step felt longer than it was. Walt moved halfway forward. Ellie, maybe we should. Commander Harris, I said, I would like to correct one factual error. David still held the jacket. Lauren rose from the front table. Ellie, this is exactly what we were worried about. Adele's voice cut across the room, calm as a gavel. Mrs. Whitaker is a trustee of the Scholarship Foundation. She has the right to address a public misstatement made at a foundation event. Lauren froze. The county judge under the flags leaned forward. Walt looked trapped between manners and truth. I reached the podium and held out my hand. That jacket is mine. David gave a sad little smile. Mom, the name says Whitaker. Yes, I said. So does my driver's license. A few people exhaled, not laughter, relief, looking for permission. I pointed to the collar. Your father retired as a sergeant first class in the United States Army. He wore chevrons. Those are not chevrons. David looked down at the collar for the first time. I let the room see him see it. Those are silver eagles, I said. Colonel's insignia. United States Air Force. The post commander's face changed. He stepped closer, took the jacket from David's hands, and examined the collar. Then he looked at the display card Lauren had printed. David, he said quietly, but the microphone caught it. This isn't your father's jacket. That was the first crack. Lauren moved quickly. It's an honest mistake. The family has many old military items. No, I said. An honest mistake becomes something else when it is used as an accusation. I opened the white envelope. David's expression hardened again. Mom, documents from decades ago aren't going to help if you don't understand what they mean. Adele turned toward the county judge. Judge Bell, would you be willing to observe the certification? The judge stood slowly. He was retired, but old authority has a way of rising with a man. He came to the podium and took the first document from my hand. Certified copy, he said after a moment. County clerk's raised seal attached. Walt leaned toward the microphone, his voice rough. Read the name. Judge Bell looked at the page. Eleanor Whitaker, Colonel, United States Air Force Nurse Corps, retired. The room changed again. Not loudly. Mature shame rarely arrives with noise. It arrives in lowered eyes, tightened mouths, people shifting in chairs because they suddenly feel the weight of what they let happen. David stared at the document as if the paper had betrayed him. I took out the award citations. I do not need applause for any of this, I said. I did not ask for this dinner to become a trial, but my son has accused me publicly of wearing honors that were not mine. I will answer publicly. Lauren stepped forward. This is inappropriate. Adele looked at her. The accusation was inappropriate. The record is merely inconvenient. Several people turned toward Lauren. I read only what mattered. Not every award, not every date. Enough. My role was aeromedical evacuation. I served as a flight nurse, chief nurse, and later squadron commander. I was not infantry. I did not claim to be. But I served in combat zones and on evacuation missions that moved wounded service members from forward locations to higher levels of care. I held up the blue logbook. This is my personal flight log. The official records are archived, but this is where I kept names I did not want to forget. David found his voice. Anyone can write in a notebook. Yes, I said. That is why notebooks are not the end of evidence. Samuel Reeves stood. He did not rise quickly either. His left leg did not allow that. He planted his cane, pushed himself up, and turned toward the podium. The room watched him with the attention people give, a man whose body has already testified before he speaks. My name is Samuel Reeves, he said. Retired Master Sergeant, United States Army. Walt immediately stepped away from the microphone and gestured him forward. Samuel walked down the aisle slowly. Each tap of his cane sounded like punctuation. David stared at him, confused. Samuel stopped beside me and looked first at my son. You don't know me, he said, but I know your mother. David swallowed. Samuel turned toward the room. On the 18th of March, 2004, I was evacuated out of Balad with injuries that should have killed me. I remember the aircraft. I remember losing pressure during descent. I remember Colonel Whitaker's voice telling me I was not allowed to die because she had paperwork. A small, broken laugh moved through the room. Samuel took a photograph from his jacket pocket and held it up. This was taken at Landstuhl 2 days later. My wife has kept it on our mantle for 22 years. Walt took the photograph and looked at it. Then he showed Judge Bell. Then he held it toward David. A younger me stood beside Samuel's hospital bed in flight gear, Colonel's eagles visible, fatigue written across every inch of my face. Grace stood from the front table before Lauren pulled her gently back into her chair. Samuel continued, Your father was a good man. I met him once at a reunion. He bragged about your mother so much she had to walk away. That sentence pierced me more deeply than accusation had. David's voice came out low. I didn't know. No, Samuel said. But you spoke as if you did. The room went still again. Lauren stepped to the side of the podium and whispered fiercely to David, Stop this. The microphone did not catch her, but I saw her mouth form the words. Adele saw it too. I could have stopped there. The jacket had been corrected. The record had been read. Samuel had spoken. Any reasonable person would have understood. But the strongest lie was not about a jacket. The strongest lie was the one David had planted in Grace, in the foundation, in the guardianship petition, in the careful suggestion that grief had made me unreliable. If I stopped at the medals, they could later say the evening had been emotional, confusing, exaggerated. They could retreat and rebuild. Adele leaned close and whispered, "Only if you choose." I looked at my granddaughter. Her small face was pale, and her eyes never left mine. I chose. "There is one more witness," I said. Lauren's head snapped toward me. David looked exhausted. "Mom, don't." The plea in his voice almost sounded like the boy he had been. Almost. "This witness cannot be cross-examined," I said. But his words were recorded before any of this began as part of the County Veterans Center's Living Memory Project. He signed the release himself. Adele took a small speaker from her bag. Walt, finally understanding that the room had moved past him, helped connect it to the hall's sound system. The Veterans Center director stood near the side wall, nodding. She had brought the archive copy herself in case anyone questioned origin. Lauren's face lost color. David whispered, "What is this?" I looked at him. "Your father." No one moved. Adele pressed play. Tom's voice filled the hall. "Not sick, not weak, living." "This is Thomas Allen Whitaker," he said, chuckling. "Sergeant First Class, United States Army, retired, though my wife still outranks me at breakfast." A soft sound moved through the room. Grief recognizing a familiar laugh. The recording continued. Adele's archived voice asked him about service, family, and legacy. Tom spoke about maintenance crews, young soldiers, long deployments, and the strange humility of doing necessary work no one photographed. Then came the part I had marked in the transcript. "My Ellie flew with the broken boys," Tom said. "She brought them home breathing. People see a nurse and think soft. They never saw her after 3 days without sleep, standing in a cargo plane with blood on her sleeves and that calm voice telling everyone what needed doing." David closed his eyes. Tom's voice went on. "She never wanted attention. That's her flaw, if you ask me. She lets silence do work. Silence was never meant to do." I felt my throat close. "If David ever hears this," Tom said, and my son's face crumpled slightly at the sound of his name. "I want him to know something. Your mother leaving was not abandonment. It was service. I know it hurt you. It hurt me too sometimes. But do not mistake pain for proof that she loved you less." Grace began to cry silently. I wanted to go to her. I did not. Not yet. The recording continued, and if anybody ever tries to put my name over hers, don't call that honoring me. I wore stripes. Ellie wore silver eagles. We both served. Tell the truth about both of us, or leave my name out of it. Adele stopped the recording. For several seconds, the hall was so quiet I could hear the fluorescent lights humming overhead. That was the main reveal. Not the record, not the photograph, not even Samuel. It was my husband, the man David had used as a weapon, taking the weapon out of his hands. David's mouth opened once. No words came. Lauren looked toward the exits. Walt Harris stepped to the microphone. His voice was rougher than before. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "I owe Colonel Eleanor Whitaker a public apology." He turned toward me. "Colonel, this post displayed your jacket under the wrong name. We allowed a public accusation to proceed without verifying the facts. That was not respect. That was failure." He looked at the room. "The record stands corrected. Colonel Eleanor May Whitaker, United States Air Force Nurse Corps, retired, is a veteran of this community, co-founder of this scholarship, and the rightful owner of the field jacket displayed tonight." No one applauded at first. I was grateful for that. Applause would have made it feel like entertainment. The room needed to sit with its discomfort. Then Samuel began clapping, slow, firm, 3 beats before anyone joined. Then another table, then the mayor, then the veterans in caps. The applause grew, not wild, not joyful, but solemn, like people standing for a hymn they finally understood. I did not smile. Some corrections are too late to feel like victory. Grace slipped away from Lauren and walked toward me. David did not stop her. She came up the aisle with tears on her cheeks and stood beside the podium. "Grandma," she whispered, "were those really Grandpa's words?" "Yes. About you. Yes." She looked at the jacket in Walt's hands. "So it was yours." "It was mine." She reached for my hand. I took it. That small hand was the reason I had chosen public pain over private endurance. Not because I needed a room full of people to know who I had been, but because she needed to know what not to believe. David stepped down from the stage. His face looked emptied. "Mom," he said. I lifted one hand. "Not here." He stopped. It was the first boundary I had ever spoken to him in public. maybe the first he had ever heard. Adele collected the documents. Samuel retrieved his photograph. Walt removed the false display card and tore it in half without asking whether ceremony allowed such things. The Veterans Center director took possession of the audiophile copy again, noting for the record that it had been played with authorization. Lauren tried to regain control in the hallway. "This has been very emotional," she told the mayor, "and the family will need privacy." The mayor, who had avoided my eyes before, looked at her directly now. "I think the foundation board will need documents." Lauren's expression tightened. Judge Bell added, "and accurate minutes." That was the second collapse. Not dramatic, administrative. The kind of collapse that happens when people who use politeness as cover suddenly remember paperwork exists. By 9:30, the hall was almost empty. The kitchen volunteers were stacking chairs. The flags still stood in their holders. The coffee had burned down to sludge. My field jacket lay folded across the table in front of me. No longer under Tom's photograph. No longer mislabeled. No longer serving a lie. David stood near the door, alone. For a moment, I saw every version of him at once. The little boy waiting at the window for my car. The teenager pretending not to care when I missed a game. The grown man grieving his father. The son who had stood at a microphone and tried to make me small. I loved all those versions. I trusted only some of them. He walked over slowly. "I didn't know about the recording," he said. "No. Dad never told me." He tried. David swallowed. "I thought you were making yourself into him." I was trying to remain myself. He looked at the jacket. I saw the name Whitaker. "You saw what helped your story." The words hurt him. They were meant to. Not cruelly, precisely. Lauren waited by the exit, arms crossed. David lowered his voice. "I was angry for a long time." "I know." "You left." "Yes." "And Dad stayed." "Yes." "I needed you." The sentence broke something in me that the public accusation had not. "I know," I said again, and this time my voice shook. "I have lived with that knowledge longer than you have been angry." He looked up. "I don't understand." "No," I said. "You don't. You turned a childhood wound into an adult weapon. That is not the same as understanding." He flinched. I did not apologize for it. Grace came from the hallway carrying her coat. She looked between us with cautious eyes. "Are we going home?" she asked. David wiped his face quickly. "Yes, sweetheart." She turned to me. "Can I call you tomorrow?" "Always." Lauren's mouth tightened, but she said nothing. That silence was not respect. It was recalculation. David did not call for 11 days. Grace did. She called the next afternoon and asked if she could come over. David brought her but did not come inside. Lauren stayed in the car. Grace carried a notebook. "I wrote questions," she said. "Then I'll answer what I can." We sat at the kitchen table where she used to color. I made cocoa even though it was too sweet and too early in the day. She opened the notebook with the seriousness of a child trying to put her world back in order. "Were you really a colonel?" "Yes." "Is that higher than Grandpa?" "In rank, yes. In importance, no. People serve in different jobs." "Did Grandpa mind?" "No, he used to joke about it." "Did you leave because you loved the Air Force more than Dad?" The question was a knife, but it deserved an honest answer. "No, I served because I believed it mattered. But your dad was a child, and sometimes it felt to him like being left." "Both things can be true." Grace thought about that. Can somebody be hurt and wrong at the same time? I looked at this 11-year-old girl, asking the question adults spend lifetimes avoiding. "Yes," I said. "That happens more often than people admit." She wrote that down. Then she asked to see the jacket. I brought it from the living room and laid it across the table. She touched the name tape first, then the silver eagles. "What do these mean?" "Connell." "Like a bird?" "Yes, a silver eagle." Daddy thought they were Grandpa's. Daddy did not look closely. She nodded with a child's ruthless fairness. "He should have." "Yes." "Did you hate him when he said that?" "No." "Were you mad?" "Very." "Can you be mad and still love somebody?" I folded the sleeve carefully. That is one of the hardest parts of being a family. Grace stayed 2 hours. Before she left, she asked if she could copy Tom's words from the transcript, the part about not mistaking pain for proof. I loved David less. I made her a copy, but I also told her something important. "Your grandfather's words matter," I said. "But you are allowed to watch my actions too. Don't believe someone only because they are dead or old or loud or related to you. Look for truth." She folded the paper into her notebook. I think Grandpa wanted Dad to do that. So do I. When David came to the porch to pick her up, he did not meet my eyes. Grace hugged me hard, then ran to the car. I watched them drive away and felt the strange ache of partial repair. Not hope exactly. Not despair either. Something unfinished. David came to my house in late January, alone. Snow had fallen overnight, just enough to powder the porch rail and soften the brown yard. He stood outside with no gloves, hands red from cold, looking like he deserved discomfort but had not planned for it. I opened the door, but did not step aside. "Can we talk?" he asked. "We can talk here?" He looked past me toward the living room, toward the house where he had grown up, where Tom's chair still sat by the window. "Okay." I wrapped my sweater tighter and waited. He took a breath. "I'm sorry." I said nothing. He looked down. "I'm sorry I used Dad's memory against you. I'm sorry I called you confused when I knew you were grieving. I'm sorry I let Lauren push the foundation towards something Dad never wanted. I'm sorry I signed that guardianship draft. And I'm sorry I let Grace hear a version of you that wasn't true." The apology hit the marks. Adele would have approved. But naming harm does not erase it. It only proves the person has finally looked at it. "Why?" I asked. He wiped his nose with the back of his hand, a boyish gesture that made my chest hurt. "Because I was angry." "That explains the feeling, not the choices." He nodded. "I know. Try again." He looked at me then, really looked. "Because being angry made me feel loyal to Dad." There it was. "And because if your service mattered as much as his, then maybe all those years you were gone weren't proof you loved us less. And if they weren't proof, then I had to admit I spent a long time punishing you for something more complicated than I wanted it to be." I held the doorframe. That was the first honest thing he had said without using it as a weapon. He continued. "Lauren wanted control. I let her call it legacy because I wanted Dad to belong to me. I wanted one parent who was only mine." I closed my eyes for a second. "You had him. I know. And you had me, even when I was gone." His face twisted. I didn't know how to feel that. "No," I said. "You didn't." He shivered. "I could have invited him in. I did not. That was not cruelty. It was restraint in the other direction. I had spent months being pressured inside my own rooms. The porch was neutral ground. I am willing to keep talking," I said. "I am willing to go to counseling with you. I am willing to help Grace understand our family without making you a villain." He looked up, hopeful. "But you will not have access to my accounts, my property decisions, or the scholarship checkbook. You will not speak for my medical state. You will not use your father's memory as a credential. And if you ever question my service publicly again, you will hear the record publicly again." He nodded, tears in his eyes. Fair?" "No," I said. "Necessary." He accepted the correction. That mattered. In April, Walt Harris called again about a correction ceremony. This time I agreed, but only under 3 conditions. No surprise speeches, no dramatizing the family conflict, no making me stand alone on a stage like an exhibit. "This is about the scholarship," I said, "and about accurate service." "Yes, Colonel," he said. The second ceremony took place in May, not on a military holiday, in the same American Legion Hall. The flags were still there. The floor still smelled of wax. The coffee was still too strong. But my place card sat at the front table this time, beside Grace. It read, Colonel Eleanor Whitaker. Not Mrs. Thomas Whitaker, not widow, not surviving spouse. My name. Tom's photograph stood beside mine in the corrected display. His folded flag was on the left. My field jacket was on the right, with a new card beneath it. Field jacket of Colonel Eleanor May Whitaker, United States Air Force Nurse Corps, retired. Aeromedical Evacuation Officer, co-founder of the Whitaker Service Scholarship. The card did not heal everything. It did not give me back the months of whispers. It did not erase the look on Grace's face when David accused me. It did not make my son's apology sufficient for trust. But it made the lie harder to resurrect. That matters. The first scholarship recipient was a 19-year-old young woman from a farming family outside Gallatin. Her name was Mia Hernandez. She planned to join the Air Force ROTC nursing program. Her father cried when she shook my hand. Her mother took too many photographs. Mia looked at the display, then at me and said, "Ma'am, I didn't know nurses could do all that in the military." I smiled. That is exactly why the record matters. Walt kept his remarks short. He corrected the history without turning the correction into theater. Judge Bell read the foundation resolution into the minutes. The Veterans Center director announced that Tom's full oral history and my own scheduled interview would be archived together, cross-referenced, so future students could hear both voices. Then Walt asked if I wanted to speak. I had prepared 3 sentences. Only 3. At my age, I had learned that long speeches are often where sincerity goes to lose weight. I stood at the same microphone my son had used against me. For a second, I saw that November night again, the moved place card, the jacket in David's hands, the room turning away, my granddaughter's eyes. Then I saw what was actually in front of me. Grace at the table, sitting upright, watching carefully. David in the second row, not at the front, not hiding either. Samuel Reeves near the aisle, cane resting against his knee. Adele Monroe with her hands folded, daring me to be sentimental but not sloppy. I looked at the students, veterans, families, and neighbors. This scholarship was never meant to make one kind of service larger than another, I said. It was meant to help young people serve with skill, humility, and truth. I paused. My husband and I both wore uniforms, we both made sacrifices, we both made mistakes. But one thing Tom understood better than most people is that love does not require erasure. The room was quiet, so let the record show both names. Let the students carry the help forward. And let every family here remember that respect should begin at home before the world has to correct it in public. I stepped away. No flourish, no revenge, just the record. After the ceremony, David approached me with Grace beside him. He had asked permission through Adele before coming over. That small act told me counseling was doing at least some work. Mom, he said, Mia's family asked for a picture with both of you. Both of whom? You and Dad's photo. He caught himself and added, and your jacket. I nodded. We took the photograph in front of the corrected display. Mia stood in the center holding her scholarship certificate. Her parents stood beside her. I stood on one side. Grace stood next to me, holding my hand. David stood at the edge, not touching the jacket, not trying to arrange the moment. After the picture, he said quietly, "Thank you for letting me be here." "I did not let you be here," I said. "You chose to come correctly." He nodded. "I'm trying." I know. That was all I gave him. It was also true. That evening, Grace called. "Grandma, I'm making a family tree for school," she said. "Sounds serious." "It is. I need your full name and Grandpa's full name and what you both did." I smiled. Thomas Allen Whitaker, Sergeant First Class, United States Army, retired, mechanic, father, grandfather, stubborn tomato grower. She giggled. "Okay. And you?" Eleanor May Whitaker, Colonel, United States Air Force Nurse Corps, retired, flight nurse, grandmother, peach cobbler expert, co-founder of the scholarship, she added. "Yes," I said, "that too." She was quiet a moment. "Grandma?" "Yes, sweetheart. I'm glad I know both." I looked toward Tom's chair, then toward the field jacket, now hanging on the hall tree by the front door. For months, that jacket had been a weapon in someone else's hands. Now it was just fabric again. Old, faded, honest. "So am I said. After we hung up, I stood in the hallway and touched the silver eagle on the collar. My fingers were older now, the skin thinner, the knuckles stiff. My body had become a record too, written in aches, scars, and mornings when I needed the railing more than I wanted to admit. But age had not made me confused about what I had lived. Grief had not made me unworthy of my own name. And motherhood, with all its absences and failures and impossible choices, had not made me a blank space for my son to fill with resentment. I forgave David in pieces. That is the only honest way to say it. Some days I could forgive the wounded child in him. Other days I could not forgive the grown man who had put my granddaughter in the front row and asked her to watch him erase me. Trust returned more slowly than forgiveness, and some parts of it may never return at all. But David kept showing up to counseling. He brought Grace on time. He stopped speaking for me in public. When someone at church called me Mrs. Thomas Whitaker, he corrected them gently. "Her name is Colonel Eleanor Whitaker," he said once, not knowing I stood close enough to hear. That did not fix everything. It did give the future a different sound. One afternoon, almost 2 years after that first dinner, Grace came over carrying a framed copy of her family tree project. She had drawn small symbols beside each name: a wrench for Tom, a pair of wings for me, a tomato plant for the cabin, a blue ribbon for the scholarship. Under my name, she had written, "She brought people home." I read those 4 words and had to sit down. Grace looked worried. "Is it wrong?" "No," I said. "It's just very right." She sat beside me and leaned her head on my shoulder the way she had when she was little. "Daddy helped me spell Colonel," she said. I closed my eyes. Outside, the late afternoon light moved across the poor trail Tom had fixed during his final summer. The sycamore leaves stirred in the wind. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked twice and gave up. I thought of the microphone, the false card, the room full of people who had looked away. I thought of my son's face when his father's voice filled the hall. I thought of the first time Tom told me not to make myself small and how long it had taken me to obey him. The photograph did not change who I was. The jacket did not make me brave. The record did not create my service. Those things only made it impossible for others to keep pretending they had never seen me. Respect should not require witnesses. A mother should not need a DD Form 214 to be believed by her child. A widow should not have to play her dead husband's voice to prove she owns her own name. But when the witnesses finally came, when the record finally spoke, when the room finally turned, I learned something I wish I had learned much younger. Dignity does not always roar. Sometimes it sits at the wrong table, with an envelope in its lap, waits for the lie to finish, and then stands.